In Australia, New South Wales, a proposal is set to be adopted as of mid-October where people will be allowed to return to in-person worship. However, there's one catch. The services will only be for the vaccinated. A couple of weeks ago, 3 pastors in Australia wrote the Ezekiel Declaration, which outlines why the passports and mandates are not only ineffective but also unbiblical and anti-freedom. I'm going to review that document here today and add my own thoughts as well. As of this date, over 2,800 Australian pastors have signed on to this treatise, and almost 20,000 church members and attendees have done so as well. It serves to note that the declaration received lots of pushback, saying the government would never mandate churches to segregate along the lines of vaxxed and unvaxxed. Only a few days later, the government is proposing just such a measure. I'm Matt Odegaard, and welcome to Church Public. Well, again, thank you for choosing Church Public. I sincerely appreciate it. If you haven't already, you can go to churchpublic.com, get some of the previous episodes. We have talked about this one in a little bit before, but I want to go through this Ezekiel Declaration today because I feel it is a very biblical and specific example of why some of these things the government is doing are not the right things. And we're going to look at that in light of the Bible, in light of what culture is saying, because that's what we do here at Church Public. We look at the Bible, we look at culture, and we try to mash the two together and see what comes out. The Bible is the source. The Bible is the foundation. We don't rest on anything else. And again, you don't have to take any of my word for it. All of the words you need are in this Bible. However, this culture is going so far, so fast, away from God, away from morality, away even from reality, that somebody has got to begin talking about what is real, what is true, and what is theological, the study of God. Theology is not just an idea. It's not just staring off into the distance and thinking about God. Theology is studying what does God say, think, do, act upon certain situations, and how are we supposed to respond in real life, in everyday things, in accordance with that. Theology is not just some far-off philosophical practice or existential practice where it doesn't have any bearing on real life. If that's the way you approach theology, then unfortunately you've been doing it wrong. We don't go into the church to hide away. We don't go into the church to escape from the world. We go into the church to figure out who God is and who we are in respect to him, and then go back out into the world and live in the world and influence the world for Jesus, for Christ. To be a Christian is to be a little Christ as we go out into this world, and this is the really important thing. And this is one of the reasons why some of these mandates are so insidious. They are not a good thing merely because they put the government in between God and the people of God. That is what they are seeking to do, and this is a problem. We have to go back to the beginning and say that even as Christ has said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. That acknowledges that we do pay deference to our governments. We do pay deference to our leaders. Even Paul in Timothy says, 1 Timothy 2, we pray for all who are in high positions in leadership and government, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This Ezekiel Declaration even points to this as well. And yet, as Jesus has said, give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God, that is creating this hierarchy. It's this hierarchy where Caesar, the government, the leaders, control certain amounts of things. But God, as a foundation underneath that, controls everything. So when the government is aligned with God, we defer to the government and we follow the government's decrees and laws. And this is right because justice is right and we should pursue justice. However, when the government does not sit on the foundation of God and goes off into the woods, goes off into a place that is secularist, humanist, atheist, whateverist, scientist even. Again, science is not anti-God. Science has created a lot of things that are wonderful and marvelous and help live our lives, and that's important. But when science becomes its own religion, when government becomes its own religion, We cannot abide by that. We have to follow God first. This is not even disobedience. It's not this civil disobedience. It's not this rising up against the system. It's not fighting in that way. It is obedience. It is obedience to God, because God is our ultimate authority, not the government. The government is supposed to create rules and laws that reinforce the values that are already in place. That's why some of the documents in America are so amazing. When they refer to things like the law of nature and nature's God, it refers directly to the fact that God has created in place in this universe certain things, and by following them, we are actually following God's way. When, in opposition to that, the government creates laws that are not according to God's way, we have to stand up and take notice of that. So that is what these pastors in Australia have done with this Ezekiel Declaration, and we're going to look at that. I will try and link that into the podcast notes as well for you, so you can read it in its entirety if you like. It's really good. I encourage it. I'm going to both summarize, paraphrase, and expound some of their ideas that I think are helpful to us that are not normal theologians or seminary professors or the like, where we need to understand more the day-to-day of what this looks like. And I think this is important. I think it's important to us, even here in America. I know we're talking about Australia, but as I've mentioned in the past, England, Canada, Australia, and of course America are all westernized countries. And they're westernized in the fact that for a while, at least, we all followed the same kind of ideals and the same really Judeo-Christian values, though played out in some different ways. At the moment, all of those countries are going in different directions, and they're not going in Judeo-Christian directions. And that's why it's important to watch what some of these other countries are doing, because we're seeing some of the same things. And if you don't believe me, go look at some of the legislation on the books in California right now where they're proposing a vaccine passport for all. And if you don't believe, or if you think like some of the detractors of this declaration, it's going to be limited to businesses or schools or the like, you're just wrong. I don't know how else to say it. This will be mandated for all places, including, of course, churches, because of course they can. There's no way you could say, well, you have to be vaccinated to enter any business and any restaurant, but churches are fine. You can just go to church. There's no danger or a problem there. Of course not. Of course the government is going to say anywhere you go, you're going to have these things, which means they're going to have to make churches enforce these mandates and these passports. That's a problem. And I'm going to outline some of the reasons that's a problem. Not just for churches. It really is a problem in all of society. And it pains me that people don't see this. But especially it is a problem for churches. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. You can go and listen to some of those episodes. But along the lines of this Ezekiel Declaration, we're going to explore some of them again, because I think it's very clear, succinct, and important for us to understand as believers, regular believers, why this is bad for society and, more importantly, the church. So I'm going to read through some of these things, and I'm going to try to, again, present it in a way that is intelligible. I want people to understand this from a regular level. I don't want you to have to be a seminary professor. I don't want you to have to be a theologian. I want you to just be a regular believer who can pick up your Bible, read any passage, understand it, and understand what the context is in your culture. First of all, the first point that the Ezekiel Declaration gives is that the passports will create a dual class of citizens. And this is a reality, and this is a problem. You don't want to have a dual class of citizens. Just think about it. Everywhere there have been multiple classes of citizens has been a disaster. Of course, you can point to Hitler's Germany, but you can point to South Africa and apartheid. You can point to India and the caste system there. And I could go on, that anywhere that some kind of separation, segregation, even back to America and some of the Jim Crow laws of the South. These are all terrible things that cause terrible human consequences in our lives. And inequality, and that's, if we're really talking about fighting inequality, then don't pursue legislation that promotes inequality. And yet that is the very thing that we are pursuing in all of these countries. So it is a problem. It is a problem that creates this caste system and two different kinds of people. And here's the deal. You may have decided based on your risk assessment that you wanted to get vaccinated and you had good reasons. Fine. You may have decided based on some reasons that you're not able to medically get vaccinated, or you, for conscience reasons, which we're going to talk about in conscience in just a moment, you also declined vaccination. Neither of those choices is immoral. This is very important to understand. This is a choice of personal conscience, and we need to discuss that. We need to discuss how this is about the choices you make based on your conscience, based on the Holy Spirit living in you, and this is not immorality. Choosing whatever choice you make based on the Bible, based on your conscience, is not a choice of immorality. There are many, many places, I'm not going to go into them all, where God, Jesus, Paul makes clear that you have choices. You can think of Peter when he, as a very staunch and religious Jew, is suddenly allowed to make different food choices. And I know it sounds like it's not comparable to talk about food choices, but it is. The reason it was in a sense immoral for Peter to eat the wrong foods. That is the way Judaism goes. However, Jesus said, no, now we are free. And this is an important thing to consider. This is a choice of personal conscience, and we're going to go into that a little bit more. But what it does, these kind of mandates, these kind of passports, alienate those that decline based on reasons of any kind. This is the problem, whether it's conscience, whether it's medical, whether it's something else. And those that decline will be segregated out of public life. Businesses, travel, banking. There are a bunch of kind of weird and scary banking stories where banks are beginning to push some of this same kind of segregation. Of course, there's sports, shopping, schooling. If you don't believe that's coming, it is. And other aspects will all become restricted without appropriate documentation or medical assent. There is also no limiter. This is a big problem. The limiter that you have is important. When does this end? I just read an article from the CEO of Pfizer, the creator of one of the vaccines, saying that boosters will be necessary for variants, period. Thereby, this passport will be extended indefinitely. Again, what is the limiter? When you've had two, that was a limiter initially when they were talking. Now you're going to need a booster every time there's a new variant. You're going to need a booster every fall. You're going to need a booster every winter. What is the limiter? When does this end? And the reality is it does never end. Again, if you want to make this choice based on your factors, that's fine. But if you don't, based on other factors, that should be fine as well. And unfortunately, there is only one path in the salvation of this scientific journey, and that is not the path of following God. And that's why this is a big problem. We're going to continue on. Number 2, there are other health factors in this declaration. Number 2, they call undue burden. And again, I'll link to this. I'm gonna summarize it and then add some other thoughts. But other health factors, I think, is a really important point. And we know beyond this particular virus, there are other societal health concerns. Now, I'm going to talk about viruses and other things in a second, but depression and suicide are up exponentially in all of these countries, in Canada, in England, in Australia, and of course in America. And alcoholism is up, which carries tremendous social harm, from personal choices and issues to obviously domestic issues. Then, of course, there are other medical procedures as well. Many other medical procedures have been postponed or even canceled for reasons from viral concerns to flat out denial based on whether or not a person has been vaccinated. If you haven't heard this, this is actually happening in America. People are going in saying, I have a heart condition, saying I need to get checked for this, saying I have a broken bone, and the medical providers are saying, no, we will not treat you because you have not been vaccinated. They're saying, since you chose to make bad choices with this virus, you no longer are eligible for medical care. This is another big problem. If you say, hey, you can't have medical care based on your bad choices, why should we not extend that to everything else? What about sexually transmitted diseases? Those are wholly avoidable based on your personal choices, and yet I don't hear any doctors saying, no, we won't treat you because you've had bad personal choices. And of course they should not do that, because The medical profession is there to treat people regardless of condition. Just think about basically almost every medical condition could have been avoided if you had made different choices. Doctors are not supposed to say, no, we're not treating you because you made bad choices. That literally goes against the whole point of being in medicine. And yet we are having members of the news, politicians, medical professionals saying if a person is not vaccinated, they should not receive medical care. This is being said across the country by professionals and politicians and people with high standing. And this is a problem. It's not good. Just consider heart disease, which is caused by quite often something obesity. Like, should a medical care professional say, I'm sorry, you've eaten too much for the past 20 years and your heart attack is not covered? Of course, that's ridiculous. And we all know that's ridiculous. Yet, for some reason, now it's okay to say, because you haven't received this one shot, you get no medical care for anything. This is a problem. This declaration also goes into this idea that Jesus brings up in Luke 14:28 about counting the cost. This is a really good passage that you should read in Luke 14:28. Jesus says, which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether they have enough to complete it? This, of course, is a great idea for everything that you do in finances, but really in all of life. And the cost here is not one-dimensional, as, again, the news, the celebrities, the politicians, and everybody else would have you believe that the virus is the only concern. Of course, it's not. Whether it's the risk of this one virus, whether there are side effects, whether there's depression, economic factors over shutdown, passport lockouts, whether academic issues by not being able to go to school, and on and on and on. There are so many costs. This is not a one-size-fits-all. And that should be fine, living in the freedom granted not only by Jesus, but protected by the governments. Yet these governments continue to say this solution is the only factor that matters, period, regardless of other costs. This is a problem in that we're looking at one element and not the whole of society. Every individual should have the right and responsibility to weigh their costs and decide their appropriate course of action. And yet now we are told, and now mandates and passports are coming out saying that even whatever you do, there is only one solution. And children are persecuted even more heavily by this. Think of all the schooling, think of all the millions of students in America that received either substandard or no education last year. What does that cost? What is that cost going to be going forward? And what if they continue with this passport and say even children will have to be vaccinated before they can go to school in this way? Again, the CEO of Pfizer just in the last couple of weeks said they're hurriedly working on vaccines for children, of which up to this point, and this is not me talking, don't cancel me, internet overlords, the point, according to the CDC, children are at an extremely low risk of serious illness or even transmission, according to studies, of this virus. That is just scientifically true. Trust the science. We're going to trust the science on this one, to say that they need these shots in order to save them, or really what we're talking about is in order to save the teachers, is just, it's not really factual. And we need to, again, as Jesus said, count the cost. Third, conscience. I mentioned conscience before, and this is something that we really need to talk about. We really need to talk about conscience, because conscience, and I'm going to quote a little bit of the Ezekiel Declaration in this segment, but conscience is really important. Conscience is the heart of each person. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it a part of your soul. You can call it this thing, if you're an old cartoon buff, of course, it's Jiminy Cricket jumping in and saying what's good and what's bad, what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Of course, that's not the direction we're going. We're saying that conscience is more, especially to a believer who is following after God. You know that your conscience is tied both to your flesh and your spirit and the Spirit of God working in you. I would point to the Spirit of God. As you are closer to the Spirit, you will more closely understand how you should live your life. But this aspect of your soul gives direction and will towards living your life. It's your will to choose good choices and bad choices. Aristotle talks about the way that you create a habit, the way that you choose will, the way you pursue good. And I won't get in too deep into that right now for sake of time, but this gives the ability to worship God and make good decisions. So I'm going to quote from the Ezekiel Declaration now. Conscience should never be coerced. The conscience is one of the innermost expressions that animates an individual, and that allows them to worship God as well as obey a legitimate governing authority. I'll continue on. The conscience is the immediate contact of God's presence in a person's soul. So, an individual forced to act in a way that is objectionable to their conscience will never be at peace, either before God or the state. A government that endeavors to force or coerce an individual who is striving to honor God will find they only encounter resistance. Regarding the need for free conscience, Abraham Kuyper writes, conscience is therefore the shield of the human person, the root of all civil liberties, the source of a nation's happiness. End quote. Abraham Kuyper was a great theologian. He is Calvinist. Don't hold that against him. I share a lot of values with him, though I can't say that I'm Calvinist in that way. Yet his ideas on this, while he was dealing with a pandemic in his time, more than 100 years ago, are very to the point. You can look up some of his writings if you want to wade through it. Again, many of his writings are on Calvinism, which we're not going to discuss here in this place today. But we need to understand that in the sense of conscience, it's really important to have for yourself a determined conscience, a determined will that points you towards God. And some things are officially, I'll say it officially, mandated by God. As we read through what Jesus says you should do, you should absolutely do. In matters that are not specifically spelled out, like should you get vaccinated or not, we have to use our judgment, our conscience, to determine what is the best course of action. I'm hearing many pastors saying there is only one course of action on something that Jesus has not talked about, and that's a very dangerous place to be. If you say Jesus would have done this and Jesus didn't say he would have done this, you have to be very careful what you're saying and make sure it is in line with biblical reality, not just your idea. For instance, some pastors and theologians have been saying to love one another is to do this and to put yourself at risk before other people. If this is ultimately true, then you should follow that out intrinsically to the end, or extrinsically to the end. You should do everything to the detriment of yourself for the benefit of other people, even to the point of your own death. And of course, we don't and really even shouldn't do that because we have our own agency based on what God tells us, even through the Ten Commandments. We have our own agency, we have our own property, we have our own right to life. Therefore, we should live our life and then love people the best that we can with what we have. To sacrifice your very life just to sacrifice your life is not loving. We need to do both the right thing and intelligent, using, as God says, your mind to love him. How do you process through this? You can't just whole cloth say, do this one thing, period, because Jesus would have you do it. That is why we have a will. This is why we have a conscience. This is going back to Jesus saying, counting the cost. Many people don't feel we have enough information to make an appropriate decision on this treatment, and that should be okay. Again, if you feel you have enough information and you decide upon this treatment, that is perfectly fine. It is the mandates, the passports that are unacceptable. All right, I'm running out of time. I'll just say a quick thing on there, point number 4, that is societal protection. The point of this treatment is to protect society. And this may help the individual avoid the severity of symptoms. That is what the scientists, doctors are saying. But even going back to the CDC again, this is the CDC study that came out right before another mandate saying that 74% of people infected in this Massachusetts COVID outbreak were fully vaccinated. And if that is the case, then this may not mitigate as much spread as people are saying. And I don't know. The reality is we don't know. The conclusion is clearly that this treatment will not achieve zero infection or zero spread. I don't think that's possible. It doesn't seem possible, but this is the reality. And if we follow then we have to realize that restricting an individual's access to society on this treatment may not be effective or necessary. If an individual makes the risk assessment and believes this is the correct choice of treatment, then that should be what they choose. If an individual makes the assessment and determines more information is needed, that should be okay as well. They should not be ostracized from society for this choice, but that is what we are seeing, not only in these other countries, but in places like California, Washington, New York, and perhaps more as time goes on. Finally, I want to get to the most important thing, and I know it's taken a little bit of time to get here, but I think these other points were important. Church attendance. I think this is the most important point. The church cannot segregate people based on medical status. This has never been a course, and it never can be the correct application of the Bible. Jesus, our ultimate example. Again, making sure that you use the words of Jesus in the appropriate context. He ministered to the sick and broken without hesitation. He alone has the authority to regulate our worship. He is the author of our praise, and he is the one who says whether you can go to worship or not. I don't get to say if you can go worship God. That's the whole point of the gospel. That is what the priests and the religious leaders were doing in the time of Jesus, saying there were people that were unclean, there were people that could not go to worship. Jesus says, the only thing that bars you from worship is you and your sin. Once you deal with your sin through the saving grace of Jesus and faith in him, you get entrance into worship. There's a long passage where Jesus talks about that to the woman at the well in John 4. There are many other passages about that we won't go into at this time. And Jesus' command to all believers is to take the gospel to every tribe and tongue and nation, regardless of race, and in this case, medical status. To say that you cannot give the gospel to someone because of their medical status is anti-biblical, anti-gospel, anti-theological, anti-Christ. Like this is not the way This is not the way of Jesus, and we cannot do this. We cannot allow the government to say to us as the church, only these people can enter your church and other people cannot enter your church. This is where not only do you get heresy, but you lose all credibility for being part of the gospel. We cannot do that. Again, you have your conscience. You get to make whatever choice you want to make. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to tell you that you have every right to go and worship God under the freedom, authority, and grace of Jesus Christ. The only thing that bars you from worshiping God is you and your sin. And you have a way to deal with that. Read through Romans, read through, any of the letters, read through any of the Gospels, and you can find out how to come into contact with the Savior of this world, Jesus Christ. For the church or the government to say you cannot enter worship of God is just wrong, and we must push back against that. This is not being disobedient to the government. This is being obedient to the one who controls all of the world and all of life. That is the very God that we serve. We must keep this in mind. So again, this has been a story about Australia, but this is not far from home. And if we are not careful, if we do not begin safeguarding this now, standing up and talking about this now, we will see more of this here, because we see that our government wants to do the very same things. We see it in California. We see it in Washington State. We see it in New York, and we see it in Washington, D.C. with the leaders there. They want to do this for the entire country as well. And if we do not push back as individuals, as churches, as states, we will see more of this in the future. Again, I have said, we are probably entering a time where our freedoms are much less free. So we must be more and more committed to the truth of Jesus, to the truth of his gospel revealed in his holy word, and to the Spirit of God which lives in us. Don't take my word for it. Read the Bible. Check my work. Please check these scriptures on your own. It will be good for you to get into the Bible and to read about the very wonderful and loving God that we serve. I hope that God continues to bless you, and through all of this, I do hope that you continue to keep the faith. I'm Matt Odegaard for Church Public.